All right, we're going to get started, everyone. Appreciate everybody joining in today. This cold day, at least here in Charlotte, it's pretty chilly. Looks like we might get a white Christmas up in the mountains, at least. So that's looking good. I'll see. Just turned off the participant list so I could focus on my slides. But I see that some of y'all that are on now were on for part one of this webinar about waters of the United States and the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. As you can see on the first slide here, this is a follow-up to that, and I'm going to talk about the subsequent, not so much the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, but some subsequent things that have happened since that rule was released. Like to encourage y'all to submit questions if you've got any. You'll probably see that Q&A bar on your screen. I am going to wait until the end to go through the questions and answer as many as I can in the time that I've got here. But in order to get through the whole talk, in case some folks have got to cut out early before the full hour is up, that I'm going to go through the entire presentation first and then take the Q&A at the end. So if anybody's got questions, please put them in there whenever you're ready to, but I'm not going to, again, answer them until the end. So here's just a summary of the points I'm going to talk about. Navigable Waters Protection Rule summary. That I'm going to just go through a few slides that I had in part one here, just to bring those of y'all up to speed with the major components of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule update, or the release of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, and just kind of summarize what was included in there very quickly. Going to move on to talking about jurisdictional determinations and compare approved versus preliminary JDs, and what the implications of each and requirements for each are. Then I'm going to touch on the changes to nationwide permits that were released for public comment. I've got the date on the slide. I believe it was September, maybe 15th. And as well as changes to regional conditions in both the Wilmington and Charleston districts of the Corps of Engineers. And then I'm going to close with talking about waters of the state, particularly North Carolina, but also Virginia and South Carolina. As some of you may well know, there are some proposed rules for regulation or for changes to and addition to existing regulation of waters of the state in North Carolina. So I've got a number of slides on that at the end here, or at the final portion. So as many of you know, Navigable Waters Protection Rule became effective on June 22nd this year. It provides a clear definition of waters of the United States that really hadn't been provided before in such a formal setting, certainly not in writing with all the definitions and exclusions that are specified in this document. There are 4 waters of the United States categories that are detailed in that document, and again, released in the Federal Register on the 22nd of June, or became effective on the 22nd of June. I believe it was published on maybe the 15th or 18th of April, but they became effective in June. So territorial seas and traditional navigable waters, that's kind of a combination of what had previously been defined: tributaries, lakes, ponds, and impoundments, and adjacent wetlands. So territorial seas and traditional navigable waters are pretty obvious. It's the big water. This photo here is, as some of you may know, is Cape Fear River in Wilmington. You can kind of see that 74 bridge in the background there with that dinner cruise in the foreground. I've gone on that a couple times. It's pretty fun. You can see the Port of Wilmington in the background with those cranes, and so that's kind of a no-brainer with regard to waters of the United States. Those are seas and large bodies of water that are used for transportation and historically navigated. Tributaries, naturally occurring surface water channels. This new round specifically excludes ephemeral channels. Those two on the left show perennial all the way on the left and intermittent in the center there. You can see the water table is depicted as that kind of hatch on the bottom with the blue line on the top, and all the way to the right is an ephemeral channel. And what that depicts is ephemeral or intermittent and perennial channels are in contact with groundwater, with the water table for at least part of the year. And ephemeral channels have flow only in response to storm events directly. They are never or very rarely in connection with the groundwater. Lakes, ponds, and impoundments, pretty self-explanatory. For those of you in the triangle, that's Falls Lake there to the right. Go to a Falls Lake. Lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters. There are very few lakes in the southeast that are not ponds and or impoundments. And so in the northeast, there are quite a few lakes that are naturally formed, and there are certainly a few in the southeast, but that's another pretty easily defined type of water of the United States. Adjacent wetlands, this is the one that is a little more squirrely, so to speak, to define, but it is well defined in the new rule. And adjacent is the key word here. The Corps of Engineers has backed off of the isolated versus connected terms that have been used for a while. Adjacent must be immediately abutting, adjacent wetlands, that is, to be jurisdictional, must be immediately abutting other waters of the United States, or they must be documentable that they're inundated annually, in a typical year anyway, annually by waters of the United States. So they don't have to be, a good example is a floodplain pool. If it's documentable, and I'm not going to go through the details about the documentation of that analysis here, but a floodplain pool that is documentable that it's inundated in a normal year by the adjacent jurisdictional waters, that too is jurisdictional, even if it's not immediately abutting, that is immediately adjacent to those waters. But similarly, in a floodplain, and we've had several of these since the new rule came into effect in June, there can be a floodplain wetland at the toe of the slope, at the toe of the valley slope, that is essentially groundwater daylighting from the slopes coming down when it hits the floodplain. And unless it can be documented that the hydrology there, the wetting of that feature is provided by inundation in a typical year from the adjacent water, the stream or river or whatever it is, that feature can be determined to be non-jurisdictional and non-adjacent because it's again not documentable that it's inundated by water of the United States in a typical year. All right, switch, there we go. Ditches are mentioned in the new rule, but not as an independent category. Goodness. I'm not sure if I got disconnected here. Well, if I got disconnected, hopefully our support staff can show these slides. I'm on the ditch slide now. I'm going to try and reconnect. I'm not sure what happened. Give me 1 second here. Apologize for this delay here.
Okay, I think
I'm back on here.
Give me one
more second, please. Okay. Hopefully y'all can hear me. If, again, I apologize about that disconnection there. So anyway, back to the topic at hand. Ditches are mentioned in the new rule. Okay, just getting some notes from our support staff here. So the ditches are mentioned in the new rule, but they are not an independent category of waters of the United States. They are evaluated on a case-by-case basis and can be, like the photo on the right, or potentially cannot be, as in the example on the left there. There's also specifically excluded features, which is very helpful, with regard to defining what is clearly not considered a water of the United States. And I'm not going to read through this whole list here, but having that list of both what are considered and what are not considered waters of the United States is very helpful with regard to being a member, both a practitioner and a member of the permitted community. Very helpful to have those clear definitions, and that's a first for the implementation of Section 404 and 401 of the Clean Water Act, to have these written down. All right, so that's the end of the summary there. Going on to the next portion here. There we go. Jurisdictional determinations. There are two types of jurisdictional determinations. For those of y'all that are not aware, jurisdictional determination is a confirmation directly by the Corps of Engineers in, well, not every single time in the field, but very often in the field, that they confirm or adjust the location and extent of what was mapped by the permitted community consultants or others, in very few cases landowners. But that's what a jurisdictional determination is the site visit and or review of the supporting documentation of the location and extent of jurisdictional features or the lack thereof. And there are two types. There's a preliminary jurisdictional determination and an approved jurisdictional determination. The preliminary is merely advisory. That is, it discusses in general the presence or absence of features that are, well, as you see in the third line item there for the preliminary, it presumes all features are jurisdictional. That is, that they're all waters of the United States. Whereas an approved jurisdictional determination is the final opinion of the Corps of Engineers in writing, and it speaks to the presence or absence of features. A preliminary JD, the language of it includes that those features may be present, in that it doesn't define their location and extent. And again, the approved jurisdictional determination speaks to whether the features are jurisdictional or not jurisdictional, whereas the preliminary assumes all that are shown in there are. And so there's different scenarios that can be done on a large parcel. For example, if there are quite a number of features that are jurisdictional and adjacent to each other, that typically will be the parcel, the area of review, the project area will typically be split out, and the approved JD will only be applied to the portions that contains some or all features that are not jurisdictional. Preliminary JD doesn't expire. An approved JD is only valid for 5 years, after which it needs to be renewed. Oftentimes the results of that renewal are the same, but sometimes there's not. If hydrology or impervious surface or other conditions have changed, there's certainly an ability for an update that changes the location and extent of features. An approved JD requires Waters of the U.S. documentation. In other words, documentation that features are waters of the United States, as well as documentation that some of those features, if applicable, are not waters of the United States. And the final difference between them is the ability to appeal. Preliminary JD cannot be appealed. A preliminary JD can move forward and progress or evolve into an approved JD if the applicant so desires, but a preliminary JD in and of itself cannot be appealed, whereas an approved JD can be appealed. That is, if the applicant disagrees with the results that the Corps of Engineers conveys in the JD document itself or in the field as it's discussed, but then it will always be supported by the written documentation. An approved JD can be appealed, and sometimes the ruling and the location and extent of features within what the Corps provides can change. Okay, so nationwide permits. There are proposed changes, as you can see here. This is a little clip from the Federal Register from September 15th. And this is a request for comment and review of proposed changes. And as you can see in the little red box there, comments were requested and due last month, the middle of last month. And so this publication of the Federal Register had the listing of all the proposed changes, as well as some of you may be aware, nationwide permits are renewed every 5 years, and the current round was scheduled to expire in 22. The 2017 to 2022 round of nationwide permits was in place already, and the proposed changes modified some components of some of those, but some of the nationwides remain the same. So in order to keep all of those in the same 5-year cycle, all of the nationwide permits were renewed in the same publication of the Federal Register, whether they were changed or not. Some of the, and by the way, I'll just preface this next part of the talk here with, there were quite a lot of changes, some of which were significant, and I think I'll at least touch on many, if not most of those here, but there were quite a lot of changes in the proposed rules, and I'm not going to go through all of that. That's a 2 or 3 hour talk in and of itself, concentrating on just that. So I'm going to focus on the main changes and the ones that are significant to most of the permitted community and most practitioners. One of the top ones there, or the top one there, one of the most significant or most interesting, I guess, to me, was the change of Nationwide 12. Previously, Nationwide 12 used to, oops, I put the crosshatch through the word oil where I shouldn't have. Nationwide 12 was for utility lines of all types, oil and gas pipelines, water and sewer lines, power lines. So Nationwide 12 covering all of those was struck and replaced by Nationwide 12 covering only oil or natural gas pipeline activities. And in addition, those 5, all of the nationwide permits prior to these proposed changes were numbered. And those 5 below Nationwide 12 there were added with letter references or letter names instead of the numbers, the sequential numbers that the other previous nationwide permits had. And particularly with regard to Nationwide 12, the C, D, and E there are other types of utilities that used to all be covered under Nationwide 12 collectively. You can see the electric utility line, water and other substances, and water reclamation and reuse facilities. So the water and other substances in here basically includes everything except oil, natural gas, or petrochemicals. So gaseous, liquid, liquescent, slurry substances, water, and wastewater, and other things. One of the significant changes in the proposed rules, the proposed nationwide permits, is the removal of the nationwide. So we're still at the national level here, and this is applicable to all Corps of Engineers districts. And like I showed in one of the opening summary slide, I'm going to go into the proposed regional condition changes for the Wilmington and the Charleston district here in a second. But until I get to them, just be aware that all of these proposed nationwide permit changes are national and applicable to all Corps districts. So one of the most significant ones, in my opinion, was the removal of the 300 linear foot impact limit for streams. The half-acre limit still remains as a sum of all impacts to waters of the United States, but as we'll see in a subsequent slide here, stream impacts, as proposed anyway, are now to be calculated on a unit area basis rather than a linear foot basis. This is applicable particularly, I think, to our participants in this call, to Nationwide 29, which is residential developments, Nationwide 39, 42, and 43. I think probably the top two there, 29 and 39, are the most relevant to probably a majority of our participants today. Another big change, well, not so much a big change, and honestly, I've talked about this with a number of colleagues, and not really sure why they removed intermittent stream from the definitions, because an intermittent stream, it specifies in there, is still jurisdictional, but they removed the definition of it. Perennial stream is still in there and defined. And so I'm kind of at a loss as to the reasoning for the removal of the definition of intermittent stream, but nonetheless, it ain't there no more. This was another pretty significant change with regard to utility line activities. And so it was removed from Nationwide 29, what remained as Nationwide 29 for oil and gas, but also it was not included in the new Nationwides for other utility line activities, like I said a second ago, water, sewer, and other conveyances. Or in the electrical, the new Nationwide for electrical conveyance or electrical lines. The mechanized land clearing had historically been a significant trigger for submittal requirements as well as mitigation requirements, and the notification requirement has been removed. What mechanized land clearing was, if there was a forested wetland and it was going to be cleared for construction and then remain cleared and maintained post-construction, even if there was not fill or deposition of materials into that wetland feature, that was still included in the amount of impacts that triggered notification requirements. And that's been removed. And that's a pretty significant change with regard to the number of projects and the project scale that are going to require notification now. That certainly is going to change. And the final significant change, and this has a large impact on both cost for mitigation as well as notification requirements. They removed the linear foot measurement for stream impacts. And this is across the board for all stream impacts for all nationwide permits. They certainly, in the Wilmington and Charleston districts, there was language previously about using both area and linear feet, but from a practical implementation perspective, it was linear feet that was the notification trigger, as well as mitigation measurement, impact measurement metric. And that linear foot measurement has been completely removed, and only now impacts are only now calculated as unit area, acres. And like you can see, this one example I've got on here, what this means now, and for a number of, I've got this 0.099 on here for a reason, and that is that for quite a number of nationwide permits, the notification trigger is 1/10 of an acre of impact. And so 1/10 of an acre, 850 linear feet of a 5-foot wide channel, which is a pretty good size. There are certainly some 5-foot wide intermittent channels, but most channels that are more than a couple feet wide, certainly 5 feet wide, are perennial channels. So that equates to 850 linear feet of impact of a 5-foot channel prior to requiring notification for those nationwides that have a notification trigger of 1/10 of an acre. So that, to me, is a pretty significant change. And if this gets implemented, if is the big word, especially with regard to the federal administrative changes that are looming, and I'll touch on that at the end here. If this is implemented, the impact to mitigation costs have not yet been realized. That is, there have not been revisions to both banking credit release and credit cost, as well as in North Carolina, the Division of Mitigation Services, what used to be EEP, they have not, I'm sure they're thinking about it in depth right now about the adjustment of those rate structures that are now based on linear feet of credits relative to impacts, but that's going to have a big impact on costs, and what the result of that is going to be remains to be seen. So now we'll move into changes to the regional conditions in the Wilmington and the Charleston district. And the Wilmington district, as many of you probably know, covers all of North Carolina. Their changes were published on September 29th. As you can see here, their final draft conditions for nationwide permits as proposed. And I've got several comparisons that I'm going through. As I go through here, I mostly have the language, and I'm certainly not going to read all the language of everything, but just so that y'all can see as participants what was included exactly in their proposed changes. And again, I certainly have not included every single proposed change for either the Wilmington or the Charleston district, but tried to summarize and point out some of the changes that are going to have, if implemented, pretty significant impacts on the permitted community. So you can see here, the Wilmington district, while they increased the maximum threshold for the use of a nationwide permit, whereas it used to be in the 2017, or it still is, I guess, technically, in the 2017 nationwide permit conditions, the maximum allowable was 300 linear feet. And in the 2020 proposed, it's 500 linear feet. So that is obviously an increase. But as you may notice, as I mentioned previously, nationally, the Corps of Engineers is no longer using linear feet as a metric to quantify impact. And it's a pretty significant proposed regional implementation component here that the Wilmington district is planning to continue to use linear feet as evaluation metric to quantify impacts, as well as mitigation crediting, I would assume. But again, it's increased, not quite doubled, but gone up by a good little bit from 300 to 500 linear feet here in the proposed 2020 regional conditions. This is to some degree staying the same as the 2017 rule, but adding the acreage in addition to 150 linear feet for the notification trigger. It's adding 2/10 of an acre, and I did another little calc here just to help myself as much as anybody else, but hopefully it helps you all understand or think about what 2/100 of an acre of stream bed impact equates to. And just below that trigger, what I put in here, as you can see, is getting to the maximum width and still being below both 150 linear feet and 0.02 acres. And so almost 6 foot wide, 149 feet of almost 6 foot wide stream can be impacted for PCNs or for nationwide permits that don't require, don't have PCN and reporting and submittal requirements as a default, but rather have them after a certain amount of impacts have occurred, in most cases 1/10 of an acre or 150 linear feet. So again, almost 6 foot wide creek for the ones that don't require notification for all types of impacts. And here's the mitigation threshold is kind of the same as the trigger. And so this mitigation threshold is going to apply to all nationwide permits, irrespective of their notification requirements. And I just put that that calculation in there just for the same use for the perception of what that means with regard to the 2/100 of an acre. But that is the mitigation requirement now. So I've got quite a bit of text in here with the strike through it. So this proposed change removed a lot of the specifics with regard to the placement of riprap, and the bold here is mine. And again, I'm not going to read through each of those items, but all of those were removed from that section of the regional conditions. But the placement of riprap is apparently no longer limited to the areas depicted in the work plan, whereas it used to be, if you didn't have riprap shown somewhere and you put it down somewhere else, that was a violation. And my read on this now is that is, if it's an impact, if it was already called out as an impact and you're putting riprap in a larger apron or another area, as long as that's depicted already as an impact, then that is not a violation because of the removal of this regional condition. Similarly, there's a good number of things that were removed from the culvert portion of the regional condition, and the evaluation of the passing of historic flows and spring flow without adversely altering flow velocity. That was, not designing a rocket, but there was certainly some modeling and some analysis and calculations involved in complying with that rule that has now been removed. And so I thought that was pretty interesting with regard to the design components of submittal packages. My goodness, I keep dropping off here. I apologize. It's like I dropped off again. Give it 1 second. It looks like, I'm not sure. My signal showed me as having a strong signal, so I'm not sure what the ongoing issue is here, but it appears to be connecting. But the regional conditions, if y'all can put the slides up, it's telling me I'm connecting. As you may have suspected, I've dialed in on my phone to the meeting here. Give it another minute. I apologize. There we go. Okay. And now my screen has... Okay, hopefully we're back in the saddle here. So the regional conditions, permanently maintained corridor with forested wetlands, as I pointed out previously, that was removed from the nationwide, the applicability nationally, but the Wilmington District has decided and proposed to include it in their regional conditions, and so that while it's gone away nationally and potentially in some districts, it has not done so in the Wilmington District. Another regional condition was added about fracking and reporting of discharges, accidental discharges, presumably, because discharges are from fracking, I guess by definition, are not included in the permitting packages, but and for any of y'all that have ever done any directional drilling or fracking or any other kind of hydraulic drilling, this has often been a permit-specific condition, but it is now included in the regional conditions. Maintenance, there was a number of notification requirements for Nationwide 3 that were removed that are particularly interesting with regard to the permitting requirements. I guess technically the permitting requirements haven't changed, but the submittal and the notification, formal notification to the Wilmington District has been eliminated for a number of things. Same with bank stabilization. There's been a couple of changes to that I'm not going to go through those. And again, these are all a number of the conditions within each of these nationwide have remained and remain verbatim. I'm just showing here the ones that have been taken out. Linear transportation projects. This last one here was particularly interesting to me. That what I take from this is that private projects located in tidal waters or tidal wetlands, that the nationwide can be used for those now, because that prohibition was removed. Thought that was particularly interesting. Again, nationwide 18 apparently now can be used in conjunction with nationwide 14, which is linear transportation projects to create upland situations. Again, that's interesting. Minor discharges, there's not a whole lot of linear transportation projects that have too minor of discharges, so I'm not sure how often that's going to be brought to bear, but nonetheless, it was an interesting change. Residential developments, that nationwide 29 is one that's used by a lot of the regulated community. I don't know what the percentage is. I think the highest percentage is pretty likely transportation projects, but single-family residential facilities or single-family residential developments are a pretty large portion of the permitting volume. And the removal of single-family recreational facilities was interesting that was removed from the prohibitions of the prior regional conditions. And similarly, designated waters. I thought this was interesting. I was pretty surprised by this, quite honestly, that the removal of the prohibition of impacts into those types of waters listed there, high quality waters and other types that have been, for as long as I can remember, excluded from permitting using the nationwide permit process. That's no longer the case. So that's a particularly relevant component of these changes. Also, the removal of only the use of riprap on stream banks and returning when the riprap is used in the channel bottoms to return those elevations to the pre-construction elevations. Even if the riprap is put in there, that is applicable to a whole lot of impacts that I've personally been involved with. So that's a pretty big change, in my opinion. Again, there were quite a few more details and changes in the Wilmington district, proposed changes, than I went over here, but that was my take, at least, on the most significant ones. And so I'll move on to the Charleston district. Charleston district covers all of the state of South Carolina, and that's a different district, obviously, than Wilmington. They published theirs this fall as well. They set, I was a little surprised to see this, quite honestly, that they previously did not have a mitigation threshold based on linear feet of stream impact. And now their linear feet trigger, so to speak, for mitigation is lower than North Carolina's ever has been. And it's lower than North Carolina's proposed revised triggers are. 5 thousandths of an acre, that's not a whole lot. 100 linear feet, that's not a whole lot either. And so I was surprised to see that, quite honestly. And similarly for nationwide 12, 29, 39, the applicability of nationwide permits for the loss of more than 500 feet or 5/100ths of an acre of intermittent or perennial streams is also a significant difference from the federal rules, or the proposed federal rules, I should say. The Charleston district had, went ahead one too soon. The Charleston district had quite a number of other relatively minor changes. Their proposed regional conditions, I forgot the page numbers, but I think theirs were about 10 pages, and I think North Carolina's were about 20. So that by and large, the volume of their regional conditions was smaller, as well as the changes. But just these two alone were pretty significant, I thought, with regard to how the Charleston district has regulated and what the triggers particularly have been in the Charleston district over the years. So waters of the state, the final topic here, and as many of you probably know, North Carolina's had the isolated wetland rule in place since 1996. It's been updated and debated quite often since then, updated quite a number of times. I think the most recent was in 2017. But that is state regulation for what used to be called isolated wetlands and now are just called non-jurisdictional wetlands. And this addresses only two types of wetlands. This state rule addresses only two wetland types that are not all the time considered non-jurisdictional, but oftentimes are. And those are bogs and basin wetlands. And the definition of both of those is in the North Carolina Wetland Assessment Method. And here's a little screenshot of the user manual, but it specifies those two types are the only two that are subject to the isolated wetland rule jurisdiction. In other words, anything else that is determined to be non-jurisdictional, at least up until, you'll see in a minute how that's proposed to be changed now, but up until the proposed modifications or enactment of new rules with regard to regulation of waters of the state, only basin and bog wetlands were covered. So if you got an isolated wetland approved jurisdictional determination from the Wilmington district and it was a floodplain wetland or some other wetland type, then these rules didn't apply to it. The isolated wetland rules specifically didn't apply to it. So here's just a couple screenshots. There's again, these are clips from the North Carolina Wetlands Assessment Method Manual. There's the basin wetlands, and those occur throughout the state, basically in depressions surrounded by uplands. That's really kind of like a divot in areas that are otherwise uplands, and there's a variety of reasons, natural reasons why those occur and why they're throughout the state. There's a variety of different types, but again, those are statewide basin wetlands. Bog wetlands, the other type covered by the isolated wetland rules, are typically found in the Blue Ridge and the northern inner Piedmont. So kind of northwest Piedmont area. Wilkes County is a good example of that area. But they certainly don't occur in coastal plain areas. So again, those are the two types of wetlands that have been regulated since 1996 by the isolated wetland rules in North Carolina. The notification thresholds for the isolated wetland rule in the coastal plain, they're different, as you can see, by physiographic province. Coastal plain, the notification threshold is greater than 1 acre of impact. In Piedmont, it's half an acre, and in the mountains, it's a third of an acre. And that's been in place for quite some time. So here we are, October 22nd, 2020, 6 months after Navigable Waters Protection Rule was published in the Federal Register. As you can see in the bottom line there, proposed changes to the North Carolina Wetland Regulatory Program in response to the new Navigable Waters Protection Rule, the definition of the waters of the United States. So this is a little clip. This, by the way, was just a one-page notification that was sent late in the afternoon, as I recall, on the afternoon of October 22nd, again, 6 months after the implementation of the new Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And I won't read the whole thing in here, but basically that it says that these types of wetlands are not covered, not within the scope of these rules, which is certainly true because it defines the applicability as just those two types of wetlands that I went through a second ago. Now, to say that the additional permitting is proposed because they're not in there. Again, those rules have been in place since 96, and the definitions have been in there. And so they're not within the scope of those rules, but it's after long debate and legislative action that's the case. And the next line there, impacts to these wetlands which formerly relied on the federal rule for permitting are prohibited. Well, I'll get into the prohibited in a second, but formerly relied on the federal rule, like I mentioned, there were plenty of instances where wetlands that were not basin or bog were determined to not be jurisdictional by the Corps of Engineers, and up until the publication, the release of this notice, they weren't subject to state rules either. And granted, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule may expand the number, location, and type of wetland features that are not designated as jurisdictional now, but to say that the impacts to these wetlands formerly relied on the federal rule doesn't tell the whole story, in my opinion. And I think that the language choice there is interesting. Now, that last part that I've got in the giant font and bold, impacts to any, pursuant to this notification, impacts to any non-Corps of Engineers jurisdictional wetland that is not a wetland or water that's not considered a water of the United States. There's a prohibition if they're not covered, if they're not a basin or a bog wetland covered by the isolated wetland rules. Based on this announcement, there's a prohibition on impacts to them. And that has a pretty significant bearing with regard to timelines. Come on. So here's the timeline. Again, October 22nd this year, the proposed rules were announced. They were presented to the Environmental Management Commission's Water Quality Committee on November 19th. The full EMC meeting was on November 20th. The draft rules, so again, that October 22nd notification was a single page. The draft rules, which are, I don't even remember, 10, certainly at least 10 pages. The actual draft rules that were proposed were only released about a week before the Water Quality Committee even met. So with regard to the public having an opportunity to evaluate, digest, and comment to the Water Quality Committee on their opinion on that, there really wasn't a whole lot of time allocated for that, which I found a little interesting, I guess, for a diplomatic way to say it. So the Water Quality Committee on November 19th tabled the presentation, or tabled the consideration, because essentially, as in most large decision-making bodies, there are committees that review components that are specific to their knowledge base and either move it forward to consideration before the entire group, the entire EMC in this case, or they ask additional questions or table it. In this case, the Water Quality Committee tabled this request until the next meeting, and the EMC only meets every other month. And so it didn't ever go before the EMC, and is now scheduled to go back before the Water Quality Committee on January 13th. I guess my last bullet here, the impact moratorium, I've reached out to the state the day after this got tabled and just asked for guidance with regard to that original one-page notification. And it was confirmed to me by DEQ that until the proposed rules are reviewed by EMC and thereby voted on, I assume, the moratorium stands. So the regulated community has no path forward right now to permit for impacts to non-waters of the United States, wetlands, and other waters that are not covered by the isolated wetland rules. Again, the basins and bogs. And so I've got a couple timelines there. Even if they were approved in November, approved by the Water Quality Committee, moved forward to the full EMC, approved by the EMC, implementation wouldn't have been till January 29th, assuming the 30-day waiver, because typically things that are approved by the MC have a 30-day lag period for public comment. The implementation, even with the 30-day waiver, wouldn't have been until the end of January. And without the 30-day waiver, would have been on March 26th. And so now, even if they're approved in January, the permitted community is not going to be able to submit permit applications for impacts to those types of resources until April or May. That's a pretty long time, particularly when that announcement wasn't even released until 6 months after the Navigable Waters Protection Rule was published. And I'm certainly a tree hugger, so to speak, in my heart, but at the same time, not just speaking as a consultant, but just a member of the regulated community, to shut down the ability for the public to proceed with, obviously potentially significant real estate investments and all kinds of financial commitments. To just shut the door on that doesn't, it sticks in my craw, so to speak, I guess. So that's where we are in North Carolina with the proposed rules. South Carolina, as far as I know, I would be glad to stand corrected if someone knows any different than this. But as far as I know that there's not historically been any isolated wetland rules in South Carolina. As far as I know, none are proposed at this time by DHEC. Virginia, just to bring in another southeastern state, has had isolated wetland rules for, they call them the Non-Tidal Wetlands Act, but essentially isolated wetland rules since 2001. And I've got a couple projects going up there that have got some isolated wetlands, and they're basically not mirroring the new Navigable Waters Protection Rule, but they've got like a 1/10 of an acre notification trigger and a 1/10 of an acre mitigation trigger. And so basically every water resource is regulated in Virginia, irrespective of its federal jurisdictional status. So like one of my favorite professors in college used to say, my biology and mammalogy professor, or ecology, I guess, and mammalogy professor, you say, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And I always thought that was a great phrase, because that's applicable to, which way do we go? How do we know what's at the end of the other road, and if we take the right path? And I think right now that's particularly applicable with the incoming Biden administration. With regard to the nationwide permit, the proposed changes to the nationwide permits, that might just not get implemented before that administration, before what's the November 20th, I think, is when he gets sworn in. So if those don't come into effect before, did I say November, January 20th? Before January 20th, if they don't come into effect before January 20th, I don't believe that the Biden administration is going to bring them in and implement them. With regard to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, it took the Trump administration several years to get what was called in the regulated community and among practitioners, the Obama rule, the 2015 rule. It took several years for the Trump administration to overturn that and have the Navigable Waters Protection Rule implemented. So I suspect that it will take a good little bit of time for the incoming administration to undo what's already become the federal rule. So with that, I guess we'll take questions. If I can see through them here, I guess they're in the chat box. Fork in the road quote apparently is Yogi Berra's. Yogi Bear or Yogi Berra? Huh, did not know that. Very interesting. One question is, riprap did I say that riprap in the stream is not considered a permanent impact if bottom elevation is restored? That's not necessarily the case. There are situations where that can be the case, but that what got removed, that's what I was pointing out, the permit condition, or the regional condition rather, that required riprap to be put flush with the previous elevation. That was just a requirement. There were plenty of cases where riprap in the channel bottom was still considered a permanent impact, even though it was set at the elevation. Some of the exceptions to that, from my experience, have been where plunge pools or some other, because typically riprap is put in a location that there's concern of erosion in, and that is very often in some kind of outfall, or culvert outfall, or stormwater outfall that's technically not an impact, but because it's above the ordinary high water mark, but it still has significant flow velocities entering the permitted components. And so the short answer is no, it is not always considered not an impact. All right, has anybody else got any questions? I only saw a couple there. Let me, got a question about, got any comment on Virginia DEQ state water determinations? Yeah, they pretty much use the same methodology, the 87 manual, and the regional supplements, the federal regional supplements. The definition of, and this is true for most places, including North Carolina, where there are wetlands, but they may not have connectivity to be determined to have federal jurisdiction. The definition of them is still, by and large, the same way, and that is the 87 manual. And then again, subsequent regional supplements to that, the coastal plain, the mountains and the Piedmont, different regional supplements that speak to different soil, hydrologic, and geologic conditions. But it's, by and large, all definitions of wetlands are the same. It's the jurisdictional status of that feature that's the question. All right. Anybody else? Oh, wow. Wow. I'm shocked. We're finishing up right on time, even though I had to sign back in twice. Well, appreciate y'all turning out for this event, and we'll be announcing our next one coming up here, likely early January. We'll be announcing it then, and sending invites out to certainly everybody that's on this participant list. And again, thanks for coming and participating in this, everybody, and we hope to see you at our next event. Y'all take care.
Thank you, Ward, for that great presentation, and thank you for everyone who attended. We will be sending out a follow-up email, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Ward, and the replay will be available on our website for you all to see, and have a great day.
Thanks again.